after World War II, my father and my grandmother escaped from Russia during World War II, and they made their way to Paris. And the Tolstoy Foundation brought Russians over to West Nyack, New York after World War II. So he was brought there with my grandmother, and then he met my mother there. And so I grew up in Queens, New York. And when I was a freshman in college, we always spent our summer vacations in Vermont. My father decided that he was going to move here permanently, and so he moved. I'm the oldest of 7 children, and he moved us all up here. So I've been living in Vermont about 24 years. So I have this weird sort of dual personality where my formative years were spent in the city, and then most of my grown-up life was spent in Bennington, Vermont. When I was very little, my babushka spoke Russian to me, and my parents spoke French to me. My mother's from Switzerland, so their common language is French. And then before I hit kindergarten, someone told them that I wouldn't do well in school, or I think there was more of an emphasis on assimilation versus being bilingual, and so they thought that they should only speak English to me so that I would do well, I would fit in more. So they spoke English to me from that day on, and I was pretty ticked off. I think I rebelled and refused to say cucumber in English. I said it in French. That was my last holdout. So I've grown up with languages in the house. My parents speak 4 or 5 or more languages, and it was always in the background, but my parents used it sort of as secret code, a secret language with each other. So we knew ice cream in 5 different languages. When my mother yells at me at this day, to this day, I understand clearly what she's saying, so it all comes back. My father was an atmospheric scientist and computer scientist for NASA, well, at Columbia University, and then he worked at NASA through Columbia University. And when he retired, he formed a business here in Bennington, which was also in Manchester for a time. It's Global Z International, and my mother worked with him there, and they've both recently retired, but they still go to work every day when they're in town. I think food plays a big part of my family's life, whether it's the experience of immigrants that have had no food and then come to this country. A sign of prosperity or a symbol that they were doing well was they would have dinner, and the table, they'd invite guests over, and the table would be just groaning under the weight of all this food. And this is certainly not the way Europeans eat, and this is not the way my parents eat on a regular basis. But it seemed that food was this emotional way of tying the family together. Whenever there's a crisis, my father goes into the kitchen and bangs pots and pans, and he starts cooking. And food is always, you can always tell how upset he is by how many half gallons of ice cream are in the freezer. So I've grown up around food, and when I was a teenager, wound up in the service industry, waitressing and bartending. It just seemed like a natural place to wind up, and everything in my family is about meals and food. So I started cooking and baking when I think my mother had me in the kitchen when I was around 4 years old, and I always cooked and we always baked, and meal times with my family are always, everybody's in the kitchen, they're arguing, they're talking about literature, they're drinking wine, and everybody cooks together and fights together. And I became more interested in baking when I tried to bake a cake for my first little boyfriend, and it was a colossal flop. And I suddenly realized that baking was not like cooking at all, where you could just throw things in and sort of have a sense and already know how it's going to taste. And baking was more about chemistry and very specific things about ingredients and how they interact with each other, and you had to be very precise. And that was very interesting to me. It was a challenge. I couldn't understand why I couldn't make a cookie and have it come out the way I tasted my mother's baking. So I think I was just really hell-bent on learning the craft. And so mostly, I was self-taught, but taught by my mother, who's Swiss, and the Swiss bake, everything's very precise and everything's wonderful. And so, my mother's my taster to this day. I bring her something, she's, no, not right. We have our basics that people come in, they know they're always going to find a fruit buttermilk muffin, they're always going to find scones. But then there's always something different that I want to put in the case. And we also base all of our baking on customer requests. So people will come in, especially, I love getting, you know, I had this bread in Sweden when I was growing up. I really want to duplicate it. You know, can you make this for me? And this is what it was like. And for us to make that bread and have them finally, you know, after 3 or 4 tries, yes, this is exactly what I remember, and the look of happiness on their face. And then we'll just not just bake for them, we'll bake, you know, a couple dozen items and put it in the case. So people are always coming in, there's always something they haven't tried before in the case. And it keeps, you know, people say, oh, I can't go into the bakery. It's not healthy for me, but then they're curious because they know there's going to be something weird in there too.
All right. Everyone has a guilty culinary pleasure that is inexpensive or unsophisticated. What's yours?
My friend Jimmy has a hot dog cart down the street, and I'm a sucker for hot dogs, and he makes the best hamburgers. And somebody locally makes a cabbage relish, which is not anything that I grew up with. Very European food. That's not something I grew up with. And it's like spicy on the burger, and that's my favorite food guilty pleasure. But I have to confess, I have always had a thing for Twinkies, and which is really terrible because I refuse to bake with shortening, and I'm pretty sure there's shortening in it. My dream, my holy grail is to recreate the Twinkie into something that's really fabulous with like an Italian buttercream inside, and you know, redo the cake. But it's very hard to bake cakes from scratch that are as moist or have the same texture as a box mix. You know what we do on our days off? We visit bakeries. It's terrible. And we talk about bakeries, and we watch bakery YouTubes. And that was my Valentine's Day, was watching YouTube videos about baking some sort of Italian pastry that Matt's trying to conquer. And you know, he comes to bed with baking books, and it's our whole life. We're cuckoo obsessed about baking. And it's partly because we're in our first year of business, and that's what you sort of have to do, is eat, sleep, and drink what you're doing to get your business to be successful. And we do have other interests that now we don't have time for. So I think it's this part of sharing the adventures and creative flavor profiles, and trying to get people to eat something new. And then this part about baking, that's this emotional thing with people, where it's very strongly linked to memories of smells and tastes of their childhood, their grandmother baking, or things that they've tasted in their youth that they haven't tasted. And there's something really wonderful about people coming in and tasting something or smelling the air in the bakery saying, this tastes exactly how I remember. You know, I guess in the beginning, I didn't realize the emotional aspect of baking that really has people really mesmerized with coming in here and watching. We have an open layout. People can watch what we're doing. They smell those smells, and they tell me their stories. I'm a writer disguised as a baker, and I love hearing people's stories. And it's just, it's the most wonderful thing, being able to share stories with people about baking and being able to reproduce memories. And it's really my favorite aspect about doing this, is that I'm really surprised at how cuckoo people are for really good baking. And when I started, I had a vending cart, and I did nothing but brownies. And I started, for the first time in my life, having to lock my front door because people would come into my house and say, oh my God, I love your brownies. And they'd drive down the street, honk their horns, and roll down the window, hey, crazy Russian girls, your brownies are awesome. I'm like, what is wrong with everyone that they're a brownie? But of course, I'm using Belgian chocolate and Cabot butter, and you know, I'm doing my fussy food snobbery thing to a brownie. And I was just really surprised in the beginning at how, and I think it's because it reminds them. People forget what homemade, from scratch, no shortening tastes like, and people are just so excited to have it back. From my mother, who tucked us into bed. I'm surprised we have teeth. She would tuck us into bed at night and feed us real Swiss chocolate, a little piece, a mumfully, a little taste of something sweet before we went to bed. And so I'm a huge chocolate snob, and I love to work with really good chocolate. And hazelnuts, also from my mother's side. Anything with a roasted hazelnut taste is really delicious. But my grandmother, my babushka, had a raspberry patch when I was a kid, and I have part of her raspberry patch now. And I would go out and pick raspberries with her, and she would make raspberry vodka. And that was her favorite thing to do. And so when my grandmother became ill, I found that when I was thinking about my grandmother and worrying about my grandmother, I would be picking raspberries and making raspberry conserve and I have a lot of products with real raspberry in it. Tart, not a lot of sweetness to it, and I think it's just part of this love of, it's symbolism too, because a raspberry bush, if you try to dig it up and burn it and get rid of it because it's taking over your yard, the next year you go back and it's there. It's tenacious and stubborn. So my earliest memories, besides my mother's baking and my father baked French, was going into bakeries in Montreal, where you go in and they have like miles and miles of cases. When you're a child and you go in and you look into the case and it looks like a fancy box of chocolate or jewels, and every little dessert is looking beautiful, and there's so many choices you don't know what to pick, and everything's amazing to taste. Those are still my favorite bakeries, and it's what I would wish to do here, but of course I have to cater to local tastes, and cupcakes and whoopie pies are the big thing. And then I have a little section where I could put my fancy treats. And locally there's a really good bakery in Glens Falls, New York, the Chocolate Mill, and it reminds me of the bakeries in Montreal, where you walk in and every little piece of cake is just beautiful. When I watch TV, well, we don't have cable because we're never home, but I can go onto Netflix and Hulu. When I want to watch TV, it's because I'm trying to shut my brain off, and I tend to watch like serial killer stuff and crime drama and things like that. But my children, particularly my younger ones, my 7-year-old son and my 9-year-old daughter, they love to watch cooking shows, and they love to watch the food challenges. And there's one in particular my son wants to watch over and over and over again, and it's called Chocolate Wonders, I think. And it's, they're building, the Eiffel Tower and the Roman Colosseum out of chocolate, and he's just fascinated by that. And watching my 9-year-old when she watches Ina Garten, the Barefoot Contessa, and she's cooking something and she's telling you, oh, and it smells so good, and my kids are just watching it, so they've got that food bug too. So my father got this crazy tradition where every time my sister or I were in the hospital delivering babies, and my father would appear carrying a card table with an army of slaves coming behind him carrying dishes of food, and he would march past the nurse's station and come in, and he would set up on the card table. And meanwhile, we're on a liquid diet still. And we know we have hospital food to look forward to. And my father's walking in with like a Greek lamb roast and a Thai salad, and he'll set it all up on the card table, and you eat. And yeah, so if I was naughty and wound up on death row, I would expect my father to show up with his card table and his Greek lamb roast. I have to suck it up and be happy with the fact that my pastry case on some days looks like a cupcakery, and I want to fill it with French pastry. But when I do an event, not only do I have people that have never tasted my things get to taste my things, but I get to come out and do something fun and more creative for me than a cupcake. So.